Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for attending this new faculty lecture. We're very excited to see you here and to showcase the work of our new faculty members. Today's presentation will be a poetry reading and craft conversation titled Beyond a Doubt, featuring Dr. Tobias Wray, an assistant professor in the Department of English. Dr. Wray's poetry collection, No Doubt I Will Return a Different Man, won the Cleveland State University Poetry Center's Lighthouse Poetry Series competition. Dr. Wray's work has found homes in various literary journals, including Blackbird, Hunger Mountain, Meridian, and the Georgia Review, as well as in Queer Nature, a poetry anthology from Autumn House Press. He has previously served as Director of Creative Writing at the University of Idaho in Moscow, Idaho, and is now happy to call Edmond and UCO his home. You can learn more about Dr. Wray and his work at tobiaswray.com. So I will be quiet now since we came to hear Dr. Wray and his poems and to converse. So welcome. Thank you, Dr. Wray, for speaking with us.
Thanks so much for the lovely introduction, and especially for plugging the website. I can always use some more traffic, so I really do appreciate that. Thanks for joining me for this reading. I've been really excited about this. I also want to thank Teresa Vaughn for setting things up, and Brendan as well for the promotional assistance. They've taken really good care of us new faculty, and I sure do appreciate that. So for folks who just came in, please note that this reading comes with a content warning, as some of the poems I'll be reading do contain scenes of violence, and I think it's foremost important that we take care of ourselves. So if that's not what you came here for, just be aware of that. I'd like to take our time together today as an opportunity to read some new work for all of you. So I'm especially thankful for the space, as some of this stuff has never been aired before. My collection of poems, No Doubt I Will Return a Different Man, came out a year ago this month, actually. It's been quite a whirlwind. But a lot of writing has also happened in the aftermath of publication. Those of you who do a lot of writing know time is so important for writers, for any creative endeavor, really. So last June, I took part in a month-long artist residency at Artilus Creative Center in rural Finland. We birthed out phones at Artilus. They put them in little brown envelopes and hid them from our site for the month. I got to check email about once a week for about an hour. So I did a lot of reading. I did a lot of staring into space. Sometimes I called that meditation. I walked down to the lake quite often, sometimes twice a day or more. And I did a lot of writing. I worked on the poems that have become this new manuscript. So there are two aspects to this work in terms of the craft of poetics that I'm thinking about today more recently. One is the lyric attention to detail. The way a poem freezes time and holds it steady, however uncertainly it may do that. The other is poetry's capacity to chronicle, to observe the world not unlike a scientist would. That's another way of maybe artificially holding experience still. So poetry has these two kinds of attention I'm thinking about, the vast and the minute. And a lot of times these exist within the same poem, within the same space. But I do think they're always present, that sense of scale, that sense of where we are to what sized world. So this first poem is called Each of Us Chimera. A chimera, of course, being a hybrid creature from ancient mythology, but that word evolved to describe illusions of the mind as well, unrealizable dreams as well. Each of Us Chimera. Soon after he came home to Arkansas, Mother's cousin Larry became a stone on a hill. She tells of the monkey leashed and taught to ride his shoulder as he walked the couple blocks to Maine when they were young, the 60s. They didn't know each other well, but my mother shows me as we drive by his old house where the big cage would rest there. And she tells me how the cotton drifted like snow into brightening ditches up and down every street. I imagine a white-faced capuchin, a pirate's pet with a smart red vest. She spins and I retrieve the memories. I ask her anything, the old names of mountains and saints, how to stay awake, how her cousin Larry died, and the others, how she thinks the world thinks. She tells me, and I remember. We creatures of the small and yet collective, our understanding shimmers like schools of thought glinting as it turns. She says she never suspected me, that I would have this avuncular need. Larry, too, my original. How some gay men say family to mean refuge, refutation. I needed to imagine him, to see his end. The flat and unsurprisingly plain stone, laying next to Eula and Orrin. Beyond Sentiment, July 1989. Nothing to do with AIDS, nothing to do with ghosts, those flimsy fads, nothing to do with wanting someone to have gone before and come back. Even epitaphs can lose their certainty. He died before we ever met, but I wanted to touch what remained to keep the conversation ever approaching. Visiting from Milwaukee, my ex noticed so many of the markers read unknown. Older than me, he'd never seen that before. The first thing he did back at the car was gasp dramatically. What? Looking at his phone, he said Carole King had died, but it was a hoax. She lives somewhere in Idaho. Someone once told me gay men have become a commercial for themselves, but I thought we were done buying that bullshit. Look, something is owed. If we must be both adjective and suffix, let us go before and come back. They say fetal genetic material migrates to a mother's brain and remains postpartum, reprogramming connections. Some mirrors have more questions. They say time too listens from behind. At almost 70, mom lives in event afterglow. No one's story is over yet. Half our family has fit back into the earth, into its endless holes. We try to make them proud. It was a rhesus, she corrects me. A rhesus monkey, she says after reading this. He kept it in a chicken wire cage and carried it around town on his shoulder. That was when the cotton gin was still going, gave the streets and the air a certain quality, wispy. Mom said he didn't have the same energy she was used to feeling from other men. He was missing something, neutral, flicked off. Her father asked her what she thought of him, fishing for some confirmation, she figured. There were questions when he died. She said that he was different, said she didn't know. I like to think of him that way. Impossible to know. We are in the process of a certain unraveling, as if the past exploded, and this is the sense the parts have made. I ask her anyway, our understanding glinting as it turns. Let this be why he came home, not to die, but to recombine. Cotton lining every ditch, she said, like something torn apart. My mother corrected a couple of things after this poem was published, including that Orrin's name was actually spelled with an A and not an E, and that she didn't really appreciate imagining herself in the afterglow of anything. So that poem kind of carried on in its life, even past this. So a sucker for a good book club. I joined Sophia Clark in the anti-racist work group in reading Braiding Sweetgrass this semester, and I know some of you are also reading that book. And it's been reminding me how similar poetry can be to perhaps some surprising fields like botany, which is Kimmerer's subject. How much like science, poetry is in its careful attention, the way it hones noticing, how much it prizes, as Robin Wall Kimmerer puts it, and I've been thinking about this a lot, the animacy of grammar, how the world is brought to life through words. So the first collection, this book, takes an interest in better understanding our emotional responses, our approach to family and other social bonds. Of the themes these poems sought to consider, I'd say the mainstay in every stage of drafting was always the beauty and fragility of masculinity, how we've perceived it over time and how I receive it today as someone writing now. The new manuscript of poems thinks through, I would say at this point, the impermanence of attraction, what it might mean to love despite impermanence or because of it. Those poems ask why we are so afraid of other people's pleasure to begin with, and just as often afraid of our own. What is it that we fear exactly? How do we forge stronger bonds in the absence of models or examples that would show us how to do so? So I'll read a few poems from the book and end with reading for the first time in all of history, some of the new poems written at the residency from a manuscript that's titled Husband Material. So again, from No Doubt, that's what I call him when it's just the two of us, No Doubt. A major thread in the book finds the British polymath Alan Turing as an historical guide who reveals how treacherous the path can be, I guess. Turing was convicted at the age I am now of gross indecency for having sex with a young man named Arnold Murray. He didn't survive for long after that, so I think this book tries to honor him, honor that legacy. The animated film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs came out during Turing's time, and he was enamored with it, enamored with the novelty of film animation. Found by his bedside on the morning of his death was a half-eaten apple that had been dipped in cyanide. So the poems I most often tend to read from the book are, I think, the ones that still gather together my current interests. The poems that are arriving now are still speaking to me in those ways. They all seek, I think, globally to question purity, correctness, that there could be one clear answer worth arriving at the exclusion of other possibilities. And just to give you a sense of the lines and the shape of the thing, I'm actually going to share my screen once or twice so you can read some of these. So let me see if I can hop that up. Actually, there we are. So this is Snow White. The glass coffin has handles of old wood, smooth as bone. Overhead, a tree bows over the sleeping face, a man in a dressing gown. You study his neck, where it climbs down under the collar, the direction by which a man is described. The man in the glass coffin sighs. Recognition, a leafy green. You look closer to see the fine breath rise between slightly parted lips. His two hands lay like rocks. Now the glass is fogged, nearly overcome by sleep. You reach to clean it with your breath, with your pleas, before remembering you are outside, closer to the familiar tree. This must make you some kind of royalty. Birdsong has come on. Male voices gently rise and chant from behind the hill. Perhaps they are going to war. War, the color of concrete. The man is full of dreaming, his eyes eating cake behind his lids. So that's Snow White. And that's another person. So the next poem I'm going to read is called In my dream, Turing shows me his greatest machine. Sorry, no doubt. In my dream, Turing shows me his greatest machine. The book ends with this poem, which I'll admit wasn't inspired by an actual dream, but rather a moment in a German bar in Milwaukee called Von Trier, which was playing that night a 1930s black and white film called Tarzan and His Mate, in which Tarzan leaps into a river to rescue Jane. And I keep thinking about Tarzan as a subject. I haven't really arrived at another working poem with him, but I keep kind of tackling them. How Tarzan kind of encapsulates a lot of the narrative I think we hold around white men and have for a long time now, a certain idea of masculinity, how black and white and flat, that's all become and always has been. But the scene in the film mesmerized me that night. After Tarzan leaps into the river, there's a long sequence that's more or less an underwater ballet. It's quite gorgeous. So there's that complication. The movie was also, I later learned, highly controversial for the sexual freedom it implied Maureen O'Sullivan's character Jane exercised. And I think there were even court cases, fines, there were some legal battles around that issue as well. I reimagine it in this poem as a scene where Turing reveals the meaning of beauty to me. In my dream, Turing shows me his greatest machine. Turing and I fling ourselves into a river black as a lake. We kick, ungrapple, kick, his hand heavier, pulling us down, his hand clamped like a small mandible over mine, my first jarring attempt at diving, his aim true. We sling down to where the machine, far below, curries lights over the fanged weeds. Like a flat open palm, the mechanical bottom seems to hold the river up. We reach its circuited face, where the strands button off. Turing tinkers with a panel, his hands clawing, over busy, his hands the quietest thing above the lights. From his work bubbles fury overhead, lit, then lost. I lose time. He is there, but then he is gone. He has flown into some moment I wasn't attending, leaving no instructions for proceeding. How beauty, pith-like, sits in the center of incomprehension. This, his last machine, seems to creature the blind dark, offering anything that passes there long enough, its own set of eyes. And finally, because violence is something I poorly understand, I find I'm often drawn to consider violent moments or episodes of violence from my past, and no doubt thinks through masculine identity at formation, all the father figures who instruct us in what it supposedly is to be a man, the violence inherent there. So this last poem from the book borrows a moment from Homer's Odyssey, actually, to trace some of those gaps. It's called In the Name of the Father. Or the last dream from last night. How out of spite my father kept me in a wooden cage. What is your name? Nobody. Why am I here? I tried to wake in the mornings to reach the book on his table, but after much strain, a new question folded over every sentence, lines of verse turned to a cipher for the dead language of distant seas. He was always coming down the stairs, ever approaching. I hatched a plan to blind him and escape, how he would scream and crash onto the bars, breaking them like sticks, how I would retrieve his keys. Nothing went as planned. I missed his eye and cut off his head. It rolled against the far wall and never looked away again. I do think it's strange how obsessed our culture is with violence and yet how poorly we understand it. That too is part of the nature of attraction, I guess. It's obfuscations, blurring what we see. The first poem from Husband Material I'll read is titled Gaining Ground and follows a similar track. Brutes were useful, once perhaps. The world answered brutish necessity among the horsetails and cycads, flashing eyes that lived according to the weather. My nephew, the third grader, plays Grand Theft Auto, knows the names of the men his character must torture for information. His dad keeps promising him a gun of his own, he reports with unmistakable delight. He sees me as a different sort of man, but a man all the same, someone who will be proud of his claim. I live in fear for every woman I know and for myself. The failings of convention seem apparent, yes. Who will be questioned next? Mary called me once, huddled with colleagues behind a photocopier. 8 people were gunned down only yesterday, or at least that's what made the news cycle. In every nature doc we watch, some animal eats another. Sometimes I turn away. I'll next read the first poem to be published from this new work, which is, it's exciting that something has already made it past the gate. It landed in an international online journal of LGBTQ plus poems that's edited by Mark Ward, who I think is based in Ireland. And that journal is called Impossible Archetype. So I take it as a further sign, perhaps a signpost of, where these new poems are headed. And appreciate that it was the first one to wade into the fray. A much earlier draft of this particular poem looked over the shoulder of a Neolithic artist as she painted her questions onto rock. And to be honest, I think I'd rather miss her and hope she turns up in another poem, but didn't quite make it to this one. The poem that remains, I wrote on the top floor of an abandoned university residence hall over the pandemic. It finds a speaker who also has questions, who finds himself perhaps equally untethered. And again, I will share my screen so that you can get a sense of the shape of some of this. On the nature of or relating to. White-throated swifts climb the air to this 7th floor lookout, my temporary office. I recognize their balletic assaults. Truly, hunger is everywhere and often. I study the swifts hungering over the parking. Face to the glass, I forget the ancients, their mountains. I imagine falling. Guess where I would land. From here, the city is a clever organism. The streets like feathers, like the pads of a thumb. That filial want under my palm. So I lived for several years just before moving here, really, a brief stint in Southern California, but before that, for years in the Pacific Northwest, which is a place of stark beauty. So several poems in the new manuscript pull from those spaces, and thinking back to attention, to the crafting of attention that poetry is rather good at as a form, I'll dare to say, in this space. I think that landscape, the observable world, is often very anchoring in creative work, that when we stop to look around us and pull the world a little closer, We surprise ourselves with what we see. So I think writers need to put ground under our feet in that way to give us a sense that maybe we do know where we stand. This poem is called Honoring the Limit. We rush the beach, storm its wet floor, scrape past it to the sea's softer skin. Clam guns in hand, we drive PVC pipe arms into the sand, thinking bracken, sand, sand, thinking please. Pull clams the size of a face in profile into the stomachs of our buckets. Pull them by their moonlight-colored tongues, heavy with curse songs for the winter hunt. Shrimp bubble up when the pipe is unsucked from the hole. The shrimp panic in the pool. Seagulls join us. Life, our clam dig. We take history for a tide map that studies when best to row out, how to race back. I got one at the ranger station on the drive in. Tide map, Destruction Island. That stark theater of the coast. Revolution arrives at low tide. The gun's guts are spilled out, mostly sand, but occasionally the hardness of a shell. They are always closed, the wrong color in the flashlight beam. We honor the limit, capture few. Water rushes our ankles. We have almost a mile to climb back. Large birds, maybe cranes, make a script of air, a manual for fulfillment or universal causality. We too have occasion. The fog takes our light in its arms, smothers it. So in addition to meditating on difficult subjects, asking big questions, struggling through to potentially the answer of a poem, I think in the simplest of terms, however cliche it may be, poetry also offers me a way through. It is a form I turn to meditate on hope and renewal. In that sense of making space, of meditation, I'm very grateful to walk this path in life, to understand that I can have poems to guide me. This next poem begins with an epigraph by an American poet named Linda Gregg. She writes, "I have nothing to give and make a poor servant, but I can praise the spring." It's called Ode to Spring. Spring is a forgetting, a quick paddle away from the body dropped into the lake, say, or the looking away when blood is drawn. Spring believes in everyone's gods, equally, without hesitation. Everyone's god is spring. She is not practicing, though. She is elapsed, impermanent, yet a donner of halos. Spring is scabbed over in the new edge of it all. Come and gone so many times, but she must fulfill her promises. She is firstborn, weighed down, imminent with disclosure. She whispers low. She dies just before her peak, her skin still resurrection pink. Finally, my last poem I'll read for you is actually the penultimate poem in the new manuscript, which I think it will remain so because the new manuscript has taken on a pretty strict order. It was written during the solstice in Finland during that residency. So because of the Earth's tilt in relation to its orbit around the sun, which I'm kind of explaining because I had to look it up to remind myself how light works in relation to the solstice. Because of the Earth's tilt, Finland experiences near constant light in the month leading up to summer solstice and after. So while I was there, it was difficult to sleep. So much light was bleeding in around the curtains. Waking up meant always waking up to a possible morning. But despite the strangeness of that, the disorientation, it had a real magic to it. The flowers along the road burst into life like this was the only moment, their one chance, and they just sort of shot up. The moment that a set of them would die, a new bunch would arrive. New ones would bloom almost every other day. There were insects everywhere, dragonflies, midges, mayflies, swarms of mosquitoes. There was this sort of thrumming constantly in the air, a certain frenzy to it. So in celebration of this passage through light, the Finns honor the solstice as a holiday called Juhannus, which is basically their word for midsummer. But it also, I think, has echoes of the Feast of St. John in it. So this last poem is titled Seven Flowers for Juhannus. The tradition goes, place 7 flowers under the pillow and dream of your future husband. The Americans get excited, offering each other tips on which blooms to pick. Toby, you should pick yarrow and lupin. Yes, they found their poem. We walk down the road making choices. Dandelions heave their airy spheres, wishy and white. The lupin has been heavy ripe for weeks. Wild roses. We reach the lake and climb into the boat, begin awkwardly to row out, noting the water lilies' tight, bright heads. The lake is calm, no men on the shore or anywhere in sight. I have arrived at middle life, my own beard white. We walk back, planning our crowns for Juhannus. I wash the dishes as So dries them, telling me of the erotic dream they had last night. The moment we returned, Masha started picking wild strawberries, climbing up on the rocks to reach them. Thanks so much for joining me today, for being here, for attending to these poems with me. I do think of poetry as a practice of attention, one among many nets we cast to gather the world back to us before it rushes away. I think in all of our various disciplines, we are casting those nets and we gather what we can and we try to make use of it. And I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you.
Certainly invite whatever questions. Yeah.
Thank you for an outstanding reading, wonderful poems, and wonderful reflections framing those poems. I mean, they're gifts to us, and they're beautifully gift wrapped too in your presentation. So by all means, comments, reflections, questions, observations, poems of your own, please do. Please share.
That sounded like a dare.
Hmm?
Toby, that was really wonderful. Thank you. I loved hearing you read each of Us Chimera live and in person, because I don't mind telling you that when we were looking at all the applications, I fell so in love with that poem that for me that was a poem that was it. I was like, this is our guy, you guys. This is our guy. I love that poem, and so thank you for reading it. It was wonderful to hear it. Voice.
Thank you for that, Connie. You know, I'll tell you something about each of Us Chimera. I can't seem to get away from reading it. I almost didn't include it in this particular reading, and it just felt absent, and I had to put it in. So I guess I'm a little in love with that poem too.
It's one of your greatest hits, right? Yeah.
Shoot. I feel like I shouldn't already have one of those, but thank you.
Annie?
Toby, I was interested in how many classical references I heard in these poems. And of course, the one that you noted from referencing the Odyssey, but many more I thought as well, although I may just have ancient Greek on the brain. But I wanted to ask you, you said something about the practice of poetics, and you said something about lyric. And then you said something about the kinds of attention that we can have in poetry, the vast and minute, which I think is a beautiful expression. I wondered if for you, the categories of lyric and epic are useful at all, or if that's not the same thing as what you're talking about.
No, I think it's very much there. I could have used those same words in supply. So it took me a long time to write this book, and I'm very, very glad it did, because the more that time passes since its publication, the more grateful I am that this is the version that I have in hand. But there were others, and for a very long time, the Odysseus Telemachus link was sort of a writing narrative more than the Turing poems. Like, the Turing poems hadn't really found their footing just yet. And I was enamored with Ulysses, James Joyce's Ulysses. I was very excited about kind of, in my work in translation, I did some graduate work thinking through translation, the different approaches to the Iliad and the Odyssey that have taken flight. So yeah, the lyric and the epic, I think that we all start in the middle somewhere, so there's that kind of hinge between the two. And I think that the epic frame, doesn't the lyric, when it really works to contain that first person perspective and it truly effectively freezes time, doesn't that feel so similar to the greatness of the epic? Doesn't that hold the same magic of time attenuated or stretched or doing something time is not supposed to do? I think of those two things in the same breath, maybe.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Toby, I want to pick up on that a little bit. So I too grabbed the word lyric, and for me, having studied modernism, Eliot and Yeats and a lot of that, for me, the binary is lyric v narrative, right? I mean, when we're teaching poetry, that's one of the first distinctions we have to show them. And and I was noticing how well your poetry sort of stands in the middle, because I think it can really work as lyric, but also narrative. There's a dramatic situation always, and there's even dialogue sometimes in your poetry, and you have a wonderful sense of grounding a scene, in real space. So do you have an allegiance to the notion of lyric or narrative, or I know that in poetry those are big self-defining terms, and so I wonder where you put yourself.
It's so funny, Connie, because I don't think we have talked about this before, but that was the subject of my dissertation, the lyric narrative, because yeah, good ear. You must know your stuff, Connie. The inheritance of a sense that there was a separation, or that there really needed to be, like in modernism and postmodernism, and maybe a lot of the work that was even on the desk in my MFA program, right? That poetry wanted to do and should be doing something outside of narrative. But I found myself in love with story, and I found myself, I can't write a story to save my life, but I can write a poem that reaches for a certain kind of story. And I do think in some ways that Once Upon a Time felt maybe damning. I think that a poem is always telling a story of some kind. And I tell my students, I think no matter what you're writing, you want the sense that you're pulling your reader as close to you as possible, that they're able to look right over your shoulder and gather the world that you're gathering, noticing what you're noticing, that kind of mind meld effect with them. So I think that the lyric narrative does that, and frankly these days that's what that's really more common than not. There's not as much high experimentation as there is like that lyric narrative. But yeah, when I was in school, I was studying Robert Frost. I was reading Bly. I was reading, I was thinking about Late Wife, Claudia Emerson's book, a bunch of stuff that really had its through line as that narrative mode, and how a collection of poems is sort of the meta poem you're telling, right? That together, a collection of poems sort of works as a poem does line by line to gather some sense of itself. So there's that narrative too, the larger claim we're making. Yeah. Anyway, we'll have to talk more because that's one of my favorite subjects.
Oh, great. Yeah.
So Toby, I really like the way that you bring into, in writing studies in my field, this connection between the writer and the writing. What was nice, kind of piggybacking a little bit off of Connie's comment there, is just that blurring the boundary lines between lyric and narrative, and being able to bring those together in a more intuitive piece, maybe, that's like this really reflective moment. And I'm wondering, maybe in the way that you approach your students, do you kind of bring that to them as well? Because, a lot of students feel so uncomfortable with poetry. And I was one of those students, as an English major, I'm like, don't get me to, I can't write poems, roses are red, violets are blue, that kind of silly stuff, but there's so much more to it. But to me, what your work really exemplified today was this very critical relationship between the writer and the writing. And I'm just wondering how that had maybe perhaps been useful for you with your students.
I talk a lot about vulnerability and risk with my students, how we have to take care of ourselves. And I think that there's a degree of some things are not ready to be explored yet, right? It's not like everything's fair game in that sense. But ultimately, the more that you're risking on the page, the more vulnerable you become, the more you're looking at and writing about the subject that you're really kind of afraid to explore. I think that's the work that invites other people to reconsider their own humanity, to reconsider their own position in the world. If you kind of handle things safely at a certain distance, well, that's the version of humanity we already have on display. That's the world we walk around in. But that sharp interiority is also there. And I think we turn to art, all kinds of art, to handle that, to find expression in that, to see that anew. And I hope that that's what we're doing this semester. I just did a round in Intro to Creative Writing a few moments before arriving here, where we're workshopping personal essays, creative nonfiction, and something must have struck because those were some searing essays. I was very excited to see them arrive at that work, even in rough draft form.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Janine.
So I think I finally formulated what I've been wanting to say into a question. And I know, Toby, we've talked about Ginsberg and Whitman already. So I was thinking so much of Supermarket in California with the Turing poems that you shared. But I think it's interesting that Alan Turing, is a computer scientist and engineer. And so I was wondering if you might speak to like what that might have to do with the place of poetry or the humanities more broadly in, 21st century.
Yeah. Thank you, Kate. Yeah, it's so funny. At the top of the book, there's a supermarket moment that probably, I never quite made that connection, but it's there. It's super there. I think it is that honing of attention that that's what we're after. In the space that we're inhabiting now, what happens to our curiosity? Where does curiosity go? Where do we get a chance to really activate curiosity that's not driven by anxiety, fear, pressure, deadlines, a rather rigid structure of space, the insistence of how this thing needs to get done? Wild curiosity can be very unproductive, as it turns out. I think I used to worry, and now I just kind of am curious at a great distance if the life of a writer seems frivolous at times to others, when we sort of march off into the rural Finnish wilderness and sit for a month, what people may think of that. But honestly, I don't know how I would have gotten to this work without that, because so much of that space, there were a few days of jet lag, but then after that, there was, finding room simply to let my mind wander and not need to make a list. For the first time in maybe a decade or more, I didn't make a list that month. It was weird. And I think that's it's a little difficult to get at good work that isn't a list sometimes. Yeah. So that was an appropriately meandering answer to your question.
Okay, so it's not they're not technical observations. This is just me reacting to what you wrote. I particularly appreciated the images that incorporated nature. I love Us Chimera. I've long been a fan of Annie Dillard, for example. And while it's not the same kind of writing, the attention that you pay to some of the small details really help bring those things alive. So they really spoke to me. And I also want to mention, I appreciate you grappling with the subject of violence. That can be a tough one. And I know within my own family, I had a grandfather who was in the IRA, and I had a hard time reconciling the stories I heard about him with the person that I knew. And inquiring about violence has been something that has always been in the back of my mind ever since I was a kid. And so I'm going to have to get a hold of some things of what you wrote. But it's a difficult thing to address. I think you did it in a way that I felt was very stark but soft. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Homophobia is a kind of violence, just itself. Racism, classism is violent. Anytime we sort of belittle or other. And so I'm just, I guess I'm fascinated. The new book is not doing a whole lot differently than the first in that sense. I wrote down on a student's essay just today to read Annie Dillard. So I hear you. Yeah. She's great.
Thank you again, Dr. Wray, for your poems, for all your wonderful work with our creative writing students. It's a privilege to have you here. It was great to see everyone here. We need to take these moments in these really challenging times to really reflect, to enjoy art, to engage. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you again, Toby.
Thank you.